Hey everyone, and welcome back. You guys wanted to know what Bernie Sanders had to say about Trump's second inauguration. We're doing a deep dive on his YouTube response to it. Let me tell you, he did not hold back.
Yeah, right off the bat, Sanders uses a very, a clever tactic. He kind of focuses on what Trump didn't say.
Yeah.
Which is a classic way to grab your attention and kind of make you think like, wait a minute, why wasn't he talking about that?
Yeah. It's like he's saying, hey, look at all this stuff that's important to working families. And Trump is just glossing right over it.
Exactly. So Sanders dives right in, and he claims, basically, that Trump totally ignored the issues that matter most to working families. And when you look at his word choices, he uses some really, emotionally charged language.
He starts with healthcare, which he calls broken, dysfunctional, and expensive. He even throws out the stat that 1 in 4 Americans can't afford their prescriptions. That's a pretty alarming figure.
It is, and it really connects to this much larger debate that's happening right now about healthcare affordability and access in the U.S. Sanders, of course, is a big advocate for a system like they have in Canada or the U.K., where everyone is covered, regardless of their income or their job. He sees healthcare as like a human right, not a privilege.
Then he goes after the cost of prescription drugs, which he says can be up to 10 times higher in the U.S. compared to other countries. How is that even possible?
Well, one key difference is that in a lot of countries with universal health care, the government negotiates directly with the drug companies to get lower prices.
Yeah.
In the U.S., that's not how it works. Sanders is a big critic of that system. He's pointed to countries like Norway, where they have a national agency that evaluates the effectiveness of drugs and negotiates prices. And he's proposed similar ideas for the U.S.
That's interesting. So it's not just about having insurance. It's about how the whole system is set up to determine the price.
Right. And for Sanders, the current system is rigged in favor of the big pharmaceutical companies. And, he sees that as a major injustice.
Speaking of injustice, Sanders brings up some pretty bleak statistics about housing and homelessness. He says there are 800,000 homeless Americans, with millions more struggling to pay rent and keep a roof over their heads.
Yeah. This is another area where Sanders ties the issue back to economic inequality, which he sees as the root cause of a lot of societal problems. He argues that there's simply not enough affordable housing available, especially in cities, where the cost of living is just skyrocketing. He's proposed investing in building millions of new units of affordable housing, which he believes would not only help people find stable housing, but also, create jobs and stimulate the economy.
It's not just about charity. It's about a broader strategy to address this systemic issue.
Exactly. And he also points out that the lack of affordable housing disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income families, further perpetuates these cycles of poverty and inequality.
And then he drops this bombshell statistic that the 3 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. Wait. That can't be right, can it?
It is, and it really highlights the extreme levels of wealth concentration that we're seeing in the U.S. It's a situation where a tiny fraction of the population holds a vast majority of the wealth.
To make it even crazier, he points out that those 3 super rich individuals were literally sitting behind Trump, the inauguration.
It's a pretty striking visual, isn't it? It really drives home Sanders' point that there's this deep connection between political power and wealth.
Okay, wait for it. Here's the kicker. Those same 3 people saw their wealth increase by over $233 billion since the election.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering figure. And it raises all sorts of questions about how wealth is created and distributed in our current economic system. Sanders argues that this kind of wealth accumulation at the very top is unsustainable and ultimately harmful to society as a whole.
Okay. My head is spinning a little bit. So we've got healthcare, housing, and this huge gap between the rich and everyone else. What else does Sanders think that Trump missed?
Well, he shifts gears to an issue that's incredibly important to him. Climate change, Sanders points out. That Trump made absolutely no mention of it in his speech, despite, the overwhelming scientific consensus on its urgency.
Yeah.
That contrast was very deliberate on Sanders' part. He wants to make it crystal clear that he sees climate change as one of the most pressing issues facing the world, and he's been a very vocal critic of the Trump administration's environmental policy.
He's laid out all these problems that he feels are being ignored. Where does he go from there?
Well, Sanders isn't just about pointing fingers. He also offers a whole list of solutions, essentially calling for a major overhaul of pretty much everything.
So is he basically saying that we need to tear down the whole system and start over?
Well, not necessarily, but he is arguing for some pretty fundamental changes. He starts with a signature issue, Medicare for all, which would create a single-payer healthcare system in the U.S. guaranteeing healthcare as a right for everyone.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? I mean, it would completely change the way healthcare works in this country.
It would, and it's a proposal that generated a lot of debate.
What can...
You know, supporters arguing that it would create a more just and equitable system. Opponents expressing concerns about, costs and government overreach.
He's proposing a complete overhaul of healthcare. What else is on his list?
Well, remember how we talked about the high cost of prescription drugs? He proposes a number of solutions to address that, including allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, importing drugs from Canada, and capping out-of-pocket costs for patients.
That sounds like a pretty ambitious plan. It seems like he's really trying to tackle this issue.
Right.
From multiple angles.
He is, and it's important to note that he sees all of these solutions as interconnected. He believes that addressing the high cost of healthcare requires a multi-pronged approach that takes on the power of the pharmaceutical industry and puts patients first.
So it's not just about tweaks here and there. It's about like a whole new way of thinking about healthcare.
Exactly. And that's a recurring theme throughout his entire critique of Trump's speech. He's calling for systemic change, not just like Band-Aid solutions.
Okay, so we've covered healthcare. But Sanders didn't stop there. He also went after the lack of affordable housing, right?
That's right. And he proposed a pretty bold solution there, investing in building millions of new units of affordable housing across the country. He sees it as a way to address not just the immediate crisis of homelessness, but also this broader issue of economic inequality.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. I mean,
right.
How would that even work logistically? Who would pay for it?
Those are definitely valid questions. Sanders has proposed a number of ways to fund his affordable housing plan, including increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, and reallocating funds from other areas of the budget. He also points to the success of similar programs in other countries, like Vienna, Austria. A large percentage of the population lives in social housing. That's well-maintained and integrated into the city.
He's looking at models that have worked elsewhere and trying to adapt them to the U.S. context. Makes sense. But I imagine there would be a lot of pushback from people who are worried about government overreach or the cost of such a program.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But Sanders argues that the cost of inaction is even greater. He points to the social and economic consequences of homelessness and housing instability, including increased healthcare costs, lost productivity, and the strain on social services.
It's interesting how he connects these seemingly separate issues back to this central theme of economic inequality.
Right, for Sanders. These issues aren't isolated problems. They're all symptoms of a system that's rigged against working people and the poor. He believes that. Addressing economic inequality is essential to solving a whole range of social problems.
He has some pretty specific ideas about how to do that, right? He talked about, raising the minimum wage, strengthening unions, and making college tuition free.
He did. And these proposals have been central to his platform for years. He argues that raising the minimum wage to $17 an hour would lift millions of Americans out of poverty and boost the economy by putting more money in people's pockets.
That sounds great in theory. But wouldn't it also lead to, businesses raising prices and potentially laying off workers? So I've heard that argument a lot from opponents of raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, that is a common criticism. But, Sanders counters that argument by pointing to studies that show that raising the minimum wage has a positive impact on the economy overall. He also argues that businesses have a moral obligation to pay their workers a living wage.
So it's not just about economics. It's about fairness and social justice.
Exactly. And that same principle applies to his support for strengthening unions. Sanders sees unions as a crucial tool for workers to bargain for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. He argues that the decline of unions in recent decades has contributed to, the erosion of the middle class and the rise of income inequality.
It's interesting how he connects the decline of unions to these broader economic trends. I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
Yeah. It's a perspective that's often missing from mainstream discussions about the economy. Sanders is trying to shift the focus back to the needs of working people and the importance of collective action.
He also proposes making public college tuition free.
Yeah.
Right. That's another one that's been debated a lot.
It has. And it's a proposal that's particularly popular among young people who are struggling with student loan debt. Sanders argues that making college affordable would level the playing field and give everyone the opportunity to pursue higher education, regardless of their background.
But wouldn't that be incredibly expensive? Where would the money come from?
Well, Sanders has proposed a number of ways to fund free college, including, increasing taxes on Wall Street speculation and closing tax loopholes that benefit corporations and the wealthy, he argues that. The investment in education would pay off in the long run.
Yeah.
Creating a more educated and productive workforce.
It's interesting how he ties all these proposals back to this broader vision of a more just and equitable society.
That's a key takeaway here.
Right.
Sanders isn't just throwing out random policy ideas he's presenting.
Yeah.
A coherent vision for a different kind of America. One where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just the wealthy and powerful.
And he doesn't shy away from calling out those who he sees as benefiting from the current system, right? He's pretty direct about criticizing the wealthy and corporations.
It is. And, that's part of what makes him such a polarizing figure. Some people admire his willingness to speak truth to power, while others find his rhetoric, divisive and unrealistic.
Clear that. He's not afraid to ruffle some feathers. He's definitely not your typical politician.
That's for sure. And it's one of the reasons why he's been able to build such a devoted following. People are drawn to his authenticity and his unwavering commitment to his principles.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about healthcare, housing, and wages, unions, education, and climate change. Is there anything else on Sanders' list of solutions?
Well, he also talks about the need for campaign finance reform. He argues that the current system, where wealthy individuals and corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections, corrupt and undermines democracy.
Now, that's an issue that's been getting a lot of attention in recent years, especially with the rise of super PACs and dark money.
Right. And Sanders has been a vocal advocate for campaign finance reform for decades. He believes that getting money out of politics is essential to creating a system where everyone's voice is heard, not just those with the most money.
So he's basically saying that we need to change the rules of the game, to level the playing field.
Exactly. And
Right.
he sees campaign finance reform as a necessary step toward achieving many of his other goals, like Medicare for all and tuition-free college. He argues that. As long as wealthy special interests have an outsized influence on the political process, it'll be difficult to enact meaningful change.
It's fascinating how he connects all these different issues back to the central theme of power and who has it.
That's a key insight here, for Sanders. It's not just about specific policies. It's about a fundamental shift in power away from the wealthy and powerful and toward ordinary people.
So he's not just trying to fix the system, he's trying to transform it.
That's a good way to put it. He's offering a vision for a more democratic and egalitarian society, one where everyone has a fair shot at a good life.
It's easy to get lost in the specifics of all these policy proposals, but I think what's really striking is the passion and conviction behind Sanders' message. It's clear that he genuinely believes in the power of collective action to create a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, that's what's so compelling about Sanders. He's been fighting for these same ideas for decades.
Yeah.
And he's never wavered in his commitment to social justice. You can just hear it in his voice, even now, how much he cares about these issues.
Yeah, definitely not just empty rhetoric. He's put his whole career behind these ideas. And he's inspired a lot of people along the way.
And that's what makes him such a powerful force in American politics, He's not afraid to challenge the status quo, to speak truth to power, and to stand up for those who often feel
marginalized and unheard.
He's definitely not your typical politician. He's more a movement leader, someone who's trying to rally people around a shared vision of a better future.
Right, and that vision is rooted in a deep belief in the power of democracy and the idea that ordinary people can make a difference. They come together and demand change.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Sanders' response to Trump's inauguration, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's about recognizing the power of our own voices. Sanders' message is ultimately a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage in the political process and fight for the kind of world we want to live in.
Yeah. He's urging us to stay informed, to have conversations about these issues, and make our voices heard through voting, activism, any other means available to us. Exactly. And to remember that change doesn't happen overnight, It requires sustained effort, a willingness to challenge those in power, and a belief that a better world is possible.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers, active participants in shaping the future of our society.
And that's a powerful message to carry with us as we navigate the complexities of our time.
As Sanders would say, let's go forward and do it. Let's keep learning, stay engaged, and make our voices heard.
And let's never give up on the fight for a more just and equitable world.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for a world that reflects your values.